My husband left me for a younger woman and called me useless. He didn't know I was the one approving his promotion. If you're listening to this right now, stay with me, because what started as a quiet insult in my own living room ended in a boardroom where a man who thought he had already won everything realized, too late, that he had been standing in front of the one person who could take it all away from him with a single decision. And before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, because stories like this don't just happen in one place. They happen anywhere people mistake silence for weakness and kindness for lack of power. They happen in every city, in every country, in every home where someone has been quietly building something extraordinary while the people closest to them refuse to look. Tell me where you are. I read every single comment, and it matters to me. My name is Evelyn, and for 12 years I was the woman people overlooked. Not because I didn't exist, not because I didn't contribute, not because I had nothing to say or nothing to offer or nothing to bring to any table I sat at, but because I chose, deliberately, consciously, strategically, not to prove myself to people who never bothered to look closely, because I learned something early in life that took most people decades to understand. The most powerful thing you can do in a room full of people who underestimate you is let them keep underestimating you. Let them build their assumptions. Let them get comfortable. Let them speak freely and watch. To everyone around me, neighbors, colleagues, extended family, Victor's friends and colleagues and business contacts, I was simply Victor's wife, the calm one, the quiet one, the one who didn't interrupt at dinner parties, didn't argue at family gatherings, didn't demand attention or recognition or the last word in any conversation. I listened, I observed, I remembered everything. And to my husband, Victor, that quietness, which I had always thought of as a form of strength, slowly became something he resented, something he reinterpreted through the particular lens of a man whose sense of self depended entirely on looking bigger than the people around him. He needed to believe I was less, because if I was more, then what did that make him? Victor was a man who measured worth in titles, numbers, and the number of people who said his name with a particular kind of respect. When we first met, his ambition was something I genuinely admired. It made him driven, focused, purposeful, a man who knew what he wanted and moved toward it with conviction. He had grown up with very little, and he carried that history not as a wound, but as a fire. I respected that. I fell in love with that, if I'm honest. But over time, that ambition changed shape. It stopped being about building something meaningful and started being about proving something. Proving he was better, more important, more valuable, more deserving than the people around him. And the comparisons he needed most, the ones that fed him daily, were not colleagues or competitors or peers. They were with me. I was the easiest comparison. I was right there, and I was quiet. At first, the changes were subtle enough that I could have explained them away, and for a while I did. He stopped asking for my opinion on things he used to bring to me. Financial decisions that we used to talk through together, he began handling, or attempting to handle, alone. He started correcting me in conversations, not always out of accuracy, but out of habit, out of the need to be seen as the one who knew more. He would laugh lightly when I offered an observation about something business-related, brushing it off with phrases like, "You wouldn't understand how this works," or "It's more complicated than that, Evelyn," said with a particular patient condescension that was designed to make me feel small in front of whoever happened to be listening. And I let it go. For months, then years, I let it go because I told myself it was the stress of the climb, the pressure of corporate life, the inevitable friction of two people whose public roles had diverged, whose daily realities looked different from the outside. I gave him every benefit of the doubt that 12 years of marriage entitled him to receive. But it didn't stop. It evolved. It grew sharper, colder, more deliberate. He started introducing me differently at professional events, the events he brought me to less and less frequently, and when he did, with an increasing reluctance that I felt but pretended not to notice. Where he once said, "This is my wife, Evelyn," warmly, proudly, the way a man introduces someone he is glad to have beside him, he now said things like, "She prefers to stay out of all the complicated business stuff," followed by a light, conspiratorial chuckle that invited the people around him to share a small, polite amusement at my expense. And they did. Not because they knew me, not because they had any view of their own, but because he had framed the narrative before I ever had a chance to open my mouth. I want you to understand something. I could have corrected it. In any one of those moments, I could have turned to the person beside me and said something that would have reframed everything. I had the credentials. I had the knowledge. I had the history and professional standing to walk into any conversation in that room and hold my own without effort. I chose not to, not out of timidity, not out of deference to Victor's ego, though I understand why it might have looked that way from the outside. I chose not to because I was watching. I was learning who people really were when they believed I had no power. And what I saw, in the way they spoke to me, the way they dismissed me, the things they said around me assuming I wouldn't understand, was extraordinarily useful. You see more when people don't know you're looking. You hear more when people don't know you're listening. And I had become in that world effectively invisible. Victor never asked about my background in any real depth, never asked about my father's work, never asked what I actually held in my name, never showed the kind of curiosity about my life that you would expect from a man who claimed to have chosen me as his partner. To him, I was the picture beside his name, the quiet woman at his table, the one who kept the house functioning and the social engagements organized and the tone of his domestic life smooth, while he moved through the world being ambitious and important and recognized. When someone decides who you are without asking, they stop seeing anything beyond the version they've constructed. Victor had constructed a version of me that served his narrative, and he had stopped looking at the actual person standing in front of him. That was his first and most costly mistake. About a year before everything changed, Victor hired a new assistant. Her name was Chloe. She was 19, fresh from school, energetic, eager, skilled at mirroring back the qualities that whoever she was working for most wanted to see in the people around them. There was nothing malicious about her. I want to be clear about that. She was a young woman who found herself close to a man who had a great deal of charm when he chose to deploy it, and who was, I suspect, entirely unaware of how much of what she was receiving was something that had been taken from someone else. At first, she was just a name that came up occasionally in conversation. Victor would mention her efficiency, her attention to detail, how quickly she had adapted to his working style. He spoke about her the way people speak about a good tool, appreciatively, practically. But gradually, the frequency changed, the tone changed, the name appeared more often, in contexts that had nothing to do with work. There was an admiration in his voice, a kind of quickening, an energy I hadn't heard directed at me in a long time, possibly years. The late nights began to increase. Meetings that once ended at 6 stretched to 10, then 11, with explanations that became less specific, less detailed, less interested in whether I believed them. Business trips grew more frequent, sometimes announced last minute, sometimes extended without discussion, as though my schedule, my plans, my life were simply not a factor worth consulting. His phone, which had always been carelessly accessible before, became a guarded object, always face down, always within reach, always picked up before I could see the screen light up.
And the way he looked at me when he was home changed in the way that is hardest to name, but easiest to feel. It wasn't anger, it wasn't frustration, it wasn't even contempt exactly. It was indifference. The specific hollow indifference of a man who has already decided to leave, but hasn't yet scheduled the conversation. I carried it quietly, as I had carried everything else. I didn't confront him immediately, not because I didn't suspect, not because I was in denial or paralyzed or waiting for something I could bear to see. I waited because I've learned something important over the course of my life, in business and in everything else. When people are hiding something, they eventually reveal it themselves. They can't sustain the performance indefinitely. The energy required to maintain a lie erodes over time, and if you're patient, truly patient, not passively hoping but actively, calmly waiting, they will always reveal themselves. You just have to resist the urge to interrupt the process. So I waited. And the moment everything surfaced wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with a slammed door or a discovered message or a scene that announced itself as significant. It came on a quiet evening, exactly like many others, where I had prepared dinner, not out of obligation, not out of performance, but because cooking had always been one of the ways I returned myself to something grounded, something real, and where I had set the table and sat down and allowed myself, perhaps foolishly, the hope that we could simply sit together and talk the way we used to, back when we were two people who chose each other. Victor walked in late. He barely acknowledged the table, barely acknowledged me. He loosened his tie, checked his phone, and said in the tone of a man making a logistical announcement, "I'm not staying tonight." I remember the warmth of the kitchen still on my hands. I remember looking at the two place settings. I remember the particular quality of the quiet in that room. "You didn't tell me you had plans," I said. My voice was calm, not performing calm, simply calm. "Do I need to?" he replied, already impatient, already half-turned toward the door. And in that moment, the realization that had been forming for months, that I had been allowing to form at its own pace, that I had refused to rush or force or confront before it was complete, arrived, quietly, fully, without ceremony. "Is it work?" I asked, "or is it her?" He paused. That pause was everything, because a man with nothing to hide doesn't pause at that question. He doesn't need a second to calculate. He asks what you mean, or he answers immediately, or he looks hurt that you asked. A man who pauses is a man choosing between versions of the truth, deciding how much of it he still needs to manage. "Yes," he said finally, "it's her." The words landed, but they didn't break me. They didn't produce the flood I think he might have been expecting or hoping for, the tears, the pleading, the version of me that confirmed the version of me he had constructed. They landed and they clarified. They organized everything that had been accumulating for months into a single, clean, readable line. "Victor," I said quietly, "she's 19. And," he snapped, finally looking at me fully, the first time in what felt like weeks that he had actually looked at me, and what I saw in his face was not guilt, not shame, not even the awareness that he was in the process of doing something that would define him for the rest of his life. What I saw was annoyance, the annoyance of a man being slowed down by an inconvenience. "At least she's not," he said, and he paused again, and then he gestured, not at anything specific, not at a flaw, not at a failure, not at a particular thing I had done or not done. He gestured at me, at all of me, at the entirety of 12 years of my presence in his life with the casual dismissiveness of someone clearing a counter. "This," he finished. I looked at his hand. I looked at his face. I memorized both.
"You used to have something," he continued, his voice settling into a register I hadn't heard before, a kind of relief, as though he had been waiting for permission to say what he actually thought, and I had accidentally granted it by staying calm instead of breaking. "You just exist. You don't do anything. You don't contribute. You don't understand what real pressure is, what it costs to operate at a certain level, what it takes." He looked at me with something that might have been pity if there had been enough softness left in him to produce real pity. "You're comfortable. You've always been comfortable. You don't know what it means to build something." I let him finish. Then he said it. The word. "You're useless." No anger in it, no heat, no shaking hands or raised voice, or the kind of delivery that suggests the speaker is struggling with what they're saying. Just certainty, flat, matter-of-fact certainty. And that was worse than anything emotional could have been, because certainty means he had been thinking it for a long time. Certainty means the word had already been living inside him, fully formed, waiting for an exit. Certainty means he believed it the way you believe in something you've decided. I stood very still in my kitchen. I didn't argue. I didn't reach for a defense. I didn't remind him of the years, the choices, the things I had quietly carried. Not because I was defeated, but because I was watching him, filing everything. The expression on his face, the angle of his shoulders, the ease in his voice, the way a person looks when they believe they have complete power over the room they're standing in. I wanted to remember it, because I already knew that this moment, this specific ordinary Tuesday evening in my kitchen, was going to matter later in a way he couldn't yet imagine. "I'm leaving," he added, reaching for his keys from the counter. His voice had already moved on, already left the conversation. Chloe understands me. She understands ambition, forward movement, what it means to be building towards something. I'm about to get promoted, regional director, $200,000 a year, the biggest move of my career. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. "I can't carry someone like you into that kind of life. It's not fair to either of us." Someone like you. Not Evelyn, not my wife of 12 years, not the woman who sat across from him at a table where the food she had cooked was still warm. Someone like you, a category, a type, a limitation to be moved past. "Of course," I said. He hesitated, just for a second, a brief involuntary hesitation that told me my calmness had unsettled something in him. He had expected more resistance, more emotion, more of the version of me that confirmed the version of me he had constructed. But I gave him nothing. He shrugged, walked to the door, and left. The door closed, and just like that, my marriage ended. I stood in my kitchen for a moment. I looked at the table. I looked at the two place settings, the untouched food, the evening I had planned and he had not participated in. Then I carried the plates to the counter, covered them neatly, and went to my desk. I had work to do. Here is what Victor didn't know. Here is what he never asked about, never wondered about, never once considered worth investigating in 12 years of sharing a life with me. 5 years before that Tuesday evening, I had inherited my father's position as a board director in the company Victor worked for. My father, Gerald, had founded that company from a single office and one contract he signed before he had the staff to fulfill it. He had spent 30 years building it into something real and permanent and respected, and when he passed, he left me not just his shares and his equity, but his seat at the table, the actual physical seat at the boardroom table where decisions were made. Not because he thought I needed it, not as charity, not as a legacy gift designed to give me something to do, because he had watched me all my life, and he knew what I was, even when other people had stopped looking. I chose not to make that role public, not immediately, not fully, not in the way that would have attached my name to the company in every professional directory and social introduction. My father had always told me the most useful thing about a position of power is the ability to use it without advertising it.
Know what you hold. Let others reveal themselves to you before you reveal yourself to them. I had lived by that his entire life, and when he was gone, I chose to live by it in his place. I attended board meetings under my own name, with my own portfolio. I reviewed financial performance, approved or rejected senior appointments, and shaped the strategic direction of a company that employed over 400 people, including my husband, who had been working there for the last 7 years, climbing his way toward a role that had been sitting in a folder on my desk with his name on the front page. Victor's promotion file. Regional director, $200,000 a year, the biggest move of his career, the promotion he had been building toward for years, the one he had told me about with a pride that no longer included me, the one he had apparently already celebrated with a 19-year-old who understood ambition. On paper, he deserved it. I want to be honest about that because I have never been a person who allows personal feeling to distort professional judgment. His numbers were strong, his performance metrics were consistent, his results over 7 years had been, objectively, the kind of results that justify exactly this kind of advancement. If I had reviewed his file as a stranger, with no history, no knowledge of who he was at home, no memory of a Tuesday evening and a single careless word, I would have signed the approval without hesitation. But leadership is not built on numbers alone.
And character, the real thing, not the performance of it, reveals itself most clearly when someone believes no one important is watching. Victor had believed for years that no one important was watching him at home. He had believed I was furniture, comfortable, quiet, present, irrelevant furniture. And in that belief, he had allowed himself to become exactly who he really was when the public performance was switched off. I now had very complete information about that person. The morning after Victor left, I woke early. I dressed carefully, not to perform, not to impress, but because the way you dress for something tells you something about how seriously you are taking it, and I was taking this seriously. I made coffee. I sat at my desk. I opened the folder. I read Victor's promotion file from beginning to end, as though I were reading it for the first time. I reviewed every metric, every evaluation, every reference note from his direct reports. I wanted to be certain. I wanted to come to what I was about to do with the cleanness of a person who has examined everything and made a decision based on the full picture, not on anger, not on hurt, not on the particular quality of silence that follows a door closing after 12 years, on character. Because leadership, real leadership, the kind that affects 400 people's working lives and the direction of a company that my father spent 30 years building, requires a specific quality of character that has nothing to do with sales numbers. It requires how you treat people when you believe the outcome is already decided. It requires who you are in rooms where you think no one of consequence is present. It requires what you do with power over people you have already decided are less than you. Victor had shown me exactly who he was in those moments, clearly, repeatedly, over years of small dismissals and one very large, very clear, very final word. I picked up my phone and called my executive assistant. "I need a full board meeting," I said. 2 days from now. Attendance required. There was a brief pause on the other end. "The full board? Is everything all right?" "Everything is fine," I said. "I have a senior appointment decision I'd like to handle with the full table present." Another pause. "Of course, Miss Evelyn. I'll arrange it immediately." I thanked her. I closed the folder. I finished my coffee. And I went about the next 2 days exactly as I always did, with patience, with preparation, with the quiet certainty of a person who knows what they're walking toward. In those 2 days, Victor did not call. He sent one text message the evening after he left, which said only, "I hope you understand. This is for the best." No question mark, no opening for a reply, a statement, not a conversation, an ending issued rather than discussed. I read it once, set the phone down, and did not respond. He called his mother. I know this because she called me that second morning, her voice careful and sorry in the way of a woman who loves her son and is ashamed of him simultaneously. "Evelyn," she said, "I don't know what to say to you." "You don't have to say anything, Margaret," I told her. "I'm all right." And I meant it. She cried a little. I stayed on the phone with her for 20 minutes because she is a woman who deserved better from her son than the position he had put her in, and I was not going to make her pay for his choices. Before she hung up, she said, "Whatever you decide to do, Evelyn, you do it. Don't you hold back for anyone." I told her I wouldn't. That was a promise I was about to keep. The morning of the board meeting, I arrived early. I always arrive early, not to make a point, but because I was raised by a man who believed that the people who arrive first get to set the room. I set the room. I reviewed the agenda, confirmed the documentation, spoke briefly with 2 board members whose perspectives I valued, and took my place at the head of the table. The boardroom filled. The atmosphere that morning is the one that always fills a room when something significant is about to happen and the people in it can sense it without knowing what it is. A particular quality of alertness, of attention pulled slightly forward. And then Victor walked in. He walked in the way a man walks when he believes he owns the next 5 minutes, confident, composed, wearing the expression of someone managing a sense of occasion, the tie straight, the jacket pressed, the posture of a man who has prepared for a celebration. He was already reaching out to shake a colleague's hand when he looked up toward the head of the table. And he saw me. I watched it happen. I watched the confident stride slow, the extended hand stop mid-gesture, the face perform a rapid involuntary recalculation as his brain tried to reconcile what his eyes were presenting to it. His wife, in the CEO's chair, at the head of the boardroom table, in the building where he worked, the building where in approximately 3 minutes his entire professional future was going to be decided. His wife, sitting there as though she had always been there, because she had. He stopped completely. For one long exposed moment, he simply stood in the doorway of the boardroom, and I watched the color shift in his face and the absolute certainty drain from his posture in real time. The man who had gestured at me with one hand and called me useless was standing in a room full of his professional peers and superiors, and he could not speak. "Good morning, Victor," I said. My voice was calm, not cold. I want to be clear about that distinction, not sharp, not triumphant, not carrying any of the emotion that I had spent 2 days choosing not to perform, simply calm, the voice of a person who is entirely at home in the room they are sitting in. He sat down, slowly, as though movement required more coordination than it usually did. Chloe took a seat near the back of the room, her expression now actively confused, reading the faces around her for information and finding very little because the people around her were experienced enough to keep their expressions carefully neutral. The room was very quiet. I opened his file on the table in front of me. I took a moment. I turned the first few pages with the unhurried attention of someone who has all the time in the world and knows it. "Victor Reynolds," my voice carried easily in the quiet room, "you are here today for final approval of your promotion to regional director." He swallowed. I saw it clearly. "Your performance record over the last 7 years shows consistent results, strong client retention, and a track record of delivering against targets." I looked at the page. On paper, this is a compelling file. I looked up. I held his gaze across the length of the table. "But before I make this decision, I'd like to revisit something." The air in the room changed. I felt it, that collective shift in attention when people understand that something is happening they hadn't been briefed for. I set the file down.
Leadership, I said, is not a reward for good numbers. It is a responsibility given to people whose character, whose fundamental quality of judgment and integrity, and the way they treat people they believe have no power over them, justifies placing 400 people's working lives in their hands. That is the standard by which I make these decisions, not just what is on paper, who the person is when no one they consider important is in the room. I paused. Victor's jaw was tight. He was holding himself very still with the particular effort of a man trying to manage a situation through sheer composure, and discovering composure in this room on this morning was not sufficient a resource. 2 days ago, I said, I was informed that a person whose promotion I was reviewing described his partner of 12 years as useless. I let the word sit in the air of the boardroom the same way he let it sit in the air of my kitchen. Useless. It tells us that the speaker measures value purely in visible output, in title and salary, in the kind of contribution that can be pointed at in a room. It tells us that the speaker is unable or unwilling to recognize forms of intelligence, capability, and power that don't announce themselves. And it tells us something specific about what that person does with the authority they already hold. They use it to diminish the people around them when those people cannot fight. I looked directly at Victor.
That is not the character profile of a regional director, I said. That is the profile of someone who should not be given more people to lead until they understand that leadership begins with being able to see the people in the room clearly, all of them, including the ones who don't need anything from you. Victor's mouth opened slightly. No words came out. I have a responsibility to the 400 people in this company, I said, and to my father, who built it on the belief that the person at the front of the room matters less than the health of the whole. That is the standard I will apply, always. I closed the file. The promotion is not approved at this time, I said. I am recommending that the position be reevaluated in 6 months, pending a comprehensive leadership assessment, which I am also recommending be extended to all candidates for senior positions going forward. I looked around the table. Any questions? Silence. Then one of the board members, a woman named Diane, who had been with the company for 18 years and who had sat at that table long enough to have seen many things, looked at me steadily and said, "No questions from me." "Thank you, Evelyn. That was very clear." I nodded. I looked one final time at Victor, and I said the words that I had said to myself quietly in my kitchen 2 nights ago, standing in the warmth of a dinner that had gone uneaten. "If I'm useless," I said slowly, with all the calm and all the certainty he had once used on me, "then you're unemployed." And in that moment, in that boardroom, in that silence, with his colleagues and his superiors and the young woman he had brought along to witness his greatest professional triumphs sitting behind him, the man who had gestured at 12 years of my life and dismissed it with a single word understood exactly what he had done. He hadn't insulted his quiet, useless wife. He had insulted the board director. He had insulted the woman who held his future in a folder on her desk. He had insulted the daughter of the man who built the company he had spent 7 years trying to reach the top of. And she had let him. She had let him do all of it. Every dismissal, every correction, every introduction that erased her, every evening of indifference, and every practiced gesture of contempt. Because she was watching, she was gathering, she was waiting with the particular patience of a person who knows that the truth always eventually requires a room. He had nothing. Not the promotion, not the performance, not the narrative, not even the dignity of a clean exit, because the room was full of witnesses who had just watched the story rewrite itself in real time. I gathered my documents, stood, and thanked the board members for their attendance. I walked out of that boardroom with the same steadiness I had walked into my kitchen with on every ordinary morning for 12 years, without performance, without hurry, without the need for anyone in that room to recognize what they had just witnessed. I knew that was enough. Victor resigned 3 weeks later, not because I asked him to, not because any disciplinary process was initiated, but because there is a particular kind of man who cannot survive being small in front of the people whose respect he has built his identity around. When the story he had told about himself, the important man, the rising man, the man of ambition and excellence who had outgrown his quiet, useless wife, was publicly contradicted, the story collapsed, and without the story, he had nothing to sustain the performance. He did not contact me in those 3 weeks. I did not contact him. The legal processes of ending a marriage are administrative, and I handled them with the same methodical attention I brought to everything else. Our assets were divided fairly. Fairly, not generously, not vindictively, fairly. I did not want anything that wasn't mine, and I did not need to take anything of his to make a point. My lawyers handled the details. I handled my life. Chloe, from what I later understood, had ended things within days of the board meeting. She was 19, and whatever she had believed she was entering, a public professional collapse, was not part of the picture she had been shown. I hold no anger towards her. She was a young woman who was presented with a version of a man that was constructed specifically to appeal to her, and she believed it. That is not unique. That is ordinary, and she had the good sense to leave when the version she had been shown stopped being available. I want to tell you something about what I learned from all of this, because I've thought about it for a long time, not obsessively, not in the circular way of someone who hasn't moved on, but in the deliberate, honest way of someone who wants to take something useful from a painful experience. I learned that the choice to be quiet is not the same as the choice to be small. There is a version of silence that is defeat, the silence of a person who has been told they have nothing to say and has begun to believe it. But there is another version, the silence of a person who has chosen to observe before they act, who has decided that not every room requires their loudest self, who understands that real power doesn't announce itself, it waits and it sees, and when the moment comes, it is simply there, already seated, already prepared, already in possession of everything it needs. I lived in that second kind of silence, not because anyone put me there, because I chose it. And the lesson I want to leave with you is this: don't let anyone else's assessment of your value become your reality. Don't let someone else's failure to look at you properly convince you that there is nothing to see. Victor's blindness was not information about me. It was information about him. His inability to recognize what was standing in his own living room was not evidence of my limitations. It was evidence of his. The people who dismiss you most casually are often the people who can least afford to do so. They just don't know it yet. They will. My father used to say something that I have carried with me my whole life. He said, "Evelyn, you never have to prove yourself to a room full of people. You just have to know which chair is yours and sit in it." I sat in my chair, and that was the end of the story that Victor thought he was writing, and the beginning of the one I had been building all along. So, wherever you are listening from right now, tell me in the comments. Tell me if you've ever been dismissed by someone who didn't know who they were looking at. Tell me if you've ever stayed quiet in a room where speaking would have been easier and waited and trusted the process of patience over the relief of reaction. Tell me your story, because the most important thing I've learned is that we don't survive these things alone. We survive them by finding each other, by recognizing our own experience in someone else's words, by understanding that the quiet dignity you've been holding while someone told you you were nothing is also the most powerful thing in the room.
Stay with that. Stay in your chair. Know what you hold, and never, not for anyone, not for any word spoken with that particular casual certainty, not for any gesture that tries to reduce 12 years of a life to a single dismissive motion, never let them convince you that you are less than what you are. I'm Evelyn, and I was never useless. I was just waiting for the right room.